Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good to see everyone again. Welcome to the second installation of Dr. Zadoff's review for the exam. I'm glad that we can do this again. I'm glad that it worked last time. Before we start talking about the specific elements, before we start talking about some of the questions and some of the content, I just want to spend a minute talking about, again, the nature of the exam. Um, the With the exam, again, I mentioned for both the H and the A classes, it's going to be shorter, simply just because there is going to be less material on this exam, particularly for the A level classes, which is great, which is fine. It's going to be shorter. You'll have plenty of time to finish the exam. You'll have plenty of time to complete the exam. I'm going to be making sections 1 and 2 of the exam of equal weight, so that you should spend as much time as you can focusing on the reading. The reading is going to incorporate a bunch of questions where you're going to be asked to take the reading and you're going to be asked to compare and contrast the readings, both the A and the H, to things we discussed in class, to ideas we discussed in class. The readings lend themselves to comparing and contrasting. They lend themselves to taking the ideas we discussed and using them to broaden the perspective. So that's important. So I want to make sure you're aware of that. So they're going to be of equal weight, 50% each. So that's important. I will hopefully tomorrow, and I'll do this in class, confirm all of the times for those who have extra time, confirm which periods you are taking the exam. Okay, enough introductory stuff. Let's get to the questions. There are already some questions posted in the Q&A section. What I'm just going to do first is go to some of the email questions, so we can start with some of the email questions. And I'm going to start with just a couple questions from Madison. Madison asked, "What is the directory government?" So first, and again, throughout the time we'll be together tonight, I'll make sure to point out when I'm discussing H and when I'm discussing A's. The H level class does have a good deal more of content in terms of what's on the material, in terms of the reading, in terms of what we discussed in class. So there's going to be specific differences. The directory. The directory is important for really more so for the H level classes, really, because that has to deal with the end of the French Revolution. The directory was the government that existed in between the end of the Reign of Terror and the rise of Napoleon as the first consul. It was the directory was made up of two pieces of the legislature. What's key for the directory was the executive was placed in 5 people's hands to really control the government. This is the government that Napoleon takes power from in 1799. That's one piece of the question that Madison asked. Madison asked about also Adam Smith and the Industrial Revolution. In terms of Adam Smith and in terms of understanding Adam Smith for the Industrial Revolution, the key elements there has to do with his idea of laissez-faire government. Adam Smith is a proponent of laissez-faire governments. Laissez-faire meaning basically let the marketplace, let the market detail the specific parts of elements of how they work. Keep governments out. Let the people do as they please. Laissez-faire economics. That people are that the business community, that the businesses, that companies, that the marketplace can do what they want to. They can set the standards for themselves. Adam Smith is the really the first one to coin this phrase, or he's the one to coin this phrase. He's the one to think about and to theorize these ideas. In terms of the basic elements, Adam Smith has this three-pronged argument of economics. People work for their own good. Competition is important. And supply and demand. That's where Adam Smith really is focused. But again, laissez-faire, that government shouldn't have a role in the process of business, and that's the key element that of Adam Smith and of laissez-faire economics. In addition to the three laws or rules of economics mentioned in the book. The last question that Madison posed: what does the socialist have to do with the Industrial Revolution? So that is, we talked about in both sets of classes, we talked about the sort of the responses to the Industrial Revolution. We talked Malthus, we talked Ricardo. Socialism, and Malthus and Ricardo are more theorists theorizing about sort of the place of or the next steps that capitalism could take, and as a result of industrialism. Socialism and also the rise of Marx and of Marxism is a response to the industrialization. And so something we didn't discuss in class, but the textbook discusses, is the concepts of utilitarianism that Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, talking about the idea of understanding an institution, understanding an idea based on their usefulness. And that the role of government needs to make sure that the greatest good for the role of government is to ensure the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That is part of the idea, the socialist idea, that government needs to be involved in business. So in a way, in an important way, socialism and laissez-faire economics, while for our purposes they're seen as opposite ends of the spectrum, because socialism is taking the perspective that government should and ought to take part in what business does. In the context of Adam Smith believes that government really ought to be out of the game of business. This brings us sort of to the idea, really the idea expressed by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, where we see a very clear understanding and a very robust understanding of what the role of the government should be in business life. And so socialism, again, where the government, where the public, where everyone benefits from business, as opposed to private ownership, which is what laissez-faire economics really is all about. Okay, good. Let's now, I think we can go to some of the questions, posed on the Q&A. Let me just take one more look. Yeah. There's a good comparison on page 737 of the textbook between capitalism and socialism. You can take a look at that for more information, specifically about socialism itself. And okay, good. Let's take some of the questions from the Q&A. Questions piling up in the email. It's good. Questions from Talia, Gabriella, Ben, Julia, Cohn with a K. Let's take some of the questions from the Q&A here. Wow, and these are dominated by Max, Yanni, and Zach. Okay. All right, let's take one from. Let's take one from. I'm just looking for something that can be utilized for the entire class here, as opposed to something specific for H or for A. Let's see. Okay. All right, I'm just gonna go take this here from Yanni here. This is a question about reading really a lead up to the French Revolution, discussing. So this is something specifically for H, the difference between England and France in terms of the aristocracy. We mentioned this when we were really talking about the Ancien regime and the lead up to the French Revolution. The differences between the aristocracy in England and France, and the aristocracy in England is very much based on wealth, as opposed to the aristocracy in France, which is not. In England, the aristocracy is much smaller, about 400 or so families, largely based on wealth, as opposed to the aristocracy specifically in England, which was based on not particularly on wealth. You could be a fairly poor individual and still be considered part of the aristocracy. So that's important, just for the lead up for the French Revolution. That's specific for the H class. Okay, let's take a couple of more questions. Let's take a couple of more questions from the Q&A, and I can see the Q&A is building up now. Let's see. Let's take one from Max. Let's see. Max asks, can you please highlight important points in the relationship between imperialism and the effects of the Napoleonic time period? Not really sure what that means. I mean, it's Napoleon really was very early. I mean, the Napoleonic age is very early in the age of imperialism. Imperialism really begins after 1815 in the Congress of Vienna. So if you're going to find a connection there, it's really between the Congress of Vienna and imperialism. But the only real connection that I can maybe think about, and I think this is something that we haven't discussed in class, we'll get to tomorrow, is that the British, when the British are involved in South Africa at the very late, in the very late 18th century, and they largely want to stay in South Africa in order to protect their gains from the French. The French, in the early 19th century, take over the Netherlands. The Netherlands do control part of South Africa. Many of the early European inhabitants of South Africa are Dutch or from the Netherlands. They're called the Boers, and the reason why England wants to stay is simply to fend off the possible invasion from the French. But that really is the only connection I could make. Okay, let's take one more right now from the Q&A. Let's see. Let me take something from Rachel Freed. Can you please go over with the Communist Manifesto? So the Communist Manifesto by Engels and Marx, they talk about this historic relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the bourgeoisie being the employers, the proletariat being the workers. The workers were the ones who had to work in the factories, and the factories producing the goods, and they trace this historic relationship all the way back into the Middle Ages. What they then do is they after they go through this historic narrative where they talk about this dynamic, this relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat going back into history, they talk about the fact that change is needed, and they go through a series of changes of what needs to change, and they're fairly radical changes. The government needs to take charge of all of industry, no public property. Wealth is going to be redistributed amongst the people. This was a radical view of really of socialism. Again, I mentioned before, socialism is where government becomes more involved. Government controls business as opposed to government staying out of the role of business. What Marx and Engels introduces is a more radical form of the socialist idea. Their idea is that the workers in the 19th century will rise up. They will rise up. They will cause a revolution, create a revolution, and rise up against the bourgeoisie and taking the control of the means of production. Okay, good. Let us go back to some of the email questions. See what we have in front of us. So Ben Moskowitz emails sort of just to process questions, not really related to content. For the reading, are we going to have a choice for which we answer? Probably not as large of a choice that you will in the second half of the exam, but on the first part of the exam, you will have a choice made to do 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5, something in that regard. So you will have a choice, not like the second half of the exam where you'll have a much larger choice. Are we done with the material? We're going to be moving ahead with the material tomorrow, so we are not done with the material just yet. Okay. Another email question. This is one from Julia Cohn with a K. By the way, we were up to 20 viewers before we're down to 15. I know a lot of people have practicing games tonight, so I'm sure people will be watching afterwards. Okay, so Julia Cohn with a K wants to know the definition of liberalism. We mentioned, like, both in class and all of the classes, that liberalism is very tough to define as opposed to characterize. Liberalism is the desire for equality. It's the desire to ensure that all segments, all parts of society are given equality under the law. They're given equal representation in government. They're given the opportunity to vote for people in government equally. That protections, the rights of speech, of religion, are guarded and guaranteed. Liberalism and nationalism are often tied together. This is something that I said before in all of the classes. But I can almost guarantee this on the exam, you're going to be asked both the H and the A, and there are differences in terms of what the answer can be, and we can talk about that in a minute or two. But one of the questions will be more likely to talk about when liberalism and nationalism, to give an example of where they're connected and when they are not connected. In the classes, we've discussed various instances. One thing I'll mention for the honors class, which the A classes are not responsible for, the readings that you were assigned go into much more detail concerning moments of nationalism in Europe, particularly Greek nationalism. We discussed in class, and you had for the reading the 1830 uprising in France, the 1848, which you also have to read about as the additional reading, and reforms in Russia. These are specific to the H level class as opposed to the A level class. So those are all instances there where you have to think about what this relationship is between nationalism and liberalism. In these cases, specifically in the cases of Greece, do we see liberalism in addition to nationalism? Nationalism is clear in the case of Greece, but whether there is a sense of liberalism taking hold, the same can be said, and I think it's important. The same can be said for France, in the 1830s, for France in France in 1848. you need to think about, again, this is for the H class, you need to think about what really is taking hold here, whether this is both liberalism and nationalism. Again, liberalism and nationalism are often tied, but they're not necessarily tied together. Okay, let's now go back to some of the Q&A, the questions from the Q&A. Let's see here. Okay, so this is something specific for the H classes, talking about confection. This is something in the lead up, again, leading up to, oh no, sorry, this is for, so this is for both the H and both the H and the A classes. Confection was a process whereby in France, artisans began to make standardized sizes of clothing and shoes, particularly. Leading up to this is the background of this is getting back to the issue of the Industrial Revolution, in the way that artisans could deal with the factories and the rising ability of factories to produce large numbers of pieces of materials. Confection is a process whereby artisans began to produce goods not specifically for custom made, but in standard sizes for people to buy. This is sort of as a part of the response by artisans dealing with the issues of industrialization, where they have to think in new ways to earn money. Given the rise of the factory, given the rise of mass production, this is a way in which artisans, smaller stores that didn't have the means of production to produce for themselves and to make money. Okay, let's go back again to the Q&A. Let's, a lot of questions in the Q&A building up here, so that's good. Let's take something here from let's see, I'm going to try just to look for something that's both both for the H and the A. I'll take this question very briefly from Dana, who is Engels. Engels was Karl Marx's partner in writing the Communist Manifesto. Engels writes himself a book on the plight of the industrial worker in England. It's a very real, a very much non-theory driven book where he describes the really horrific working conditions of those in England. And like Marx, Engels was of the belief that the government needed to take a larger role in business and in the means of production. So he was Marx's partner. Okay, let's go back. Let's also take another Q&A. Let's see if I can find something here that's for all classes. Okay, so this is from Max, discussing the Great Reform Bill of 1832 and how it affected the liberal movements. The Great Reform Bill of 1830 to 1832, this is a way in which England, which we can see the manifestation of liberal ideas in England, the idea that everyone should be given equal opportunity to vote, and the Reform Bill comes as a result of workers who are now moving into the cities because of industrialization in the early 19th century. They don't have the opportunity to vote in representational block, meaning because of the way in which the boroughs that they're called in England were created and set up. Cities were not given proportional representation in terms of the number of people they had. So even if a city had 5 people or 500,000 people, they would still get the same number of representatives in the House of Commons. So what that meant was that very often you would have boroughs in the outside of the city, areas of land that were controlled by the wealthy, by the aristocracy. They controlled this entire areas of land which held a single vote. And so you could very often have a case where a single family or 2 or 3 or 4 families controlled a vote in parliament, whereas in cities where you have a tremendous cluster of individuals, they wouldn't have, they would have the ability just to vote for one candidate. They wouldn't have equal representation. They wouldn't be given fair representation. What the Reform Bill did was that it changed the system of voting. That's the voting that those living in the cities would be given an equal share of the vote, so that they could vote in an equal share of the House of Commons. Again, this was a bill to reform how voting was conducted, to vote members in the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament, in England. And so it was a way to ensure that everyone was given equal opportunity, so that my vote, let's say in Manchester, where I'm living among 200,000 other people, would be given the same weight as if someone was living in a great estate out in the countryside and they had control of an entire area of land. So the Great Reform Bill sought to ensure that there was equal representation amongst people, that everyone had the equal opportunity to vote, and that the way that members were voted in the House of Commons was more fair. That if a city had more people, they would then be granted a larger number of possible candidates in the House, voted into the House of Commons. So it directly represents liberal ideas of fairness in voting, of fairness in government. Okay, let's go back to some of the questions in the email. So one of the I'll answer a question. This is from Gavri Kapetz. A question concerning labor unions. I think this reading was specific to the H classes. Let me just look at, let me just confirm that in the review sheet. 738. No, sorry. So this is included in the A also. So he's asking about labor unions. So labor unions are groups, they're associations which speak for particular workers in particular fields. A union speaks for workers in a particular trade. And so by really the second half of the 19th century, we begin to see unions begin to form, particularly in Britain. Again, a union, it's a voluntary association. People coming together who are working in the same trade. If they're working in factories producing shoes, or if they're working in the coal mines. What this did was unions organized workers together into cohesive wholes, and so it organized workers together. It gave them certain opportunities. The opportunities could include the opportunity to what is called collectively bargain, meaning workers, again, by forming a union, by forming this voluntary association, forming this group, would collectively bargain for rights on their behalf, meaning the union would negotiate with either factory workers or other employers for various rights for their union, for their employees. They could bargain for better working conditions, for higher pay. And if factory owners refused to give in to these demands, then the workers would simply call a strike. A strike would be a way to ensure that the workers could get what they wanted. The textbook goes into a series of different laws concerning unions and strikes. And so, at least early in Britain, in the very, very, very late 18th, leading into the 19th century, the British Parliament outlawed unions and outlawed strikes. But by the end of the 19th century, by 1875, trade unions in Britain won the right to strike, and unions were also important in the United States, and this continues to be a politically hot button issue, even in our today even in our political sphere today. Unions are there's a tremendous debate going on in our country about whether unions can and should exist, whether they should collectively bargain. Part of what unions were able to do was to force, particularly in Britain and England, the passage of various reform laws, which ensured various reforms when it came to workers. We discussed a couple of those in class. The Factory Act: children couldn't be employed under the age of 9. The limit of the number of hours that workers, or the number of days and the number of hours that workers were able to work. So unions are, again, part of a response to the Industrial Revolution. Again, looking at the ways in which responses were conducted to the Industrial Revolution. Okay. Good. Let's go to another. Let's go to another question from the email. All right, so this is from Leah Abacassis. Can you explain socialism and capitalism? We talked about this before. Again, socialism is one of the key elements of socialism, is that the government should have a large role in government. The government that government should have a large role in business. Business should not just be something conducted outside of the boundaries of governments. Capitalism is the economic system where production, whether it's factories, are owned privately. They're owned by individuals, as opposed to the government's getting involved. Capitalism is simply the theory, the system, where you have private ownership of production, or you have private ownership of businesses. Okay, good. Let's go to another question from the email. Here's a question. Okay, we talked about that. All right, let's go back to the Q&A. All right, we're down to 14 viewers now. We were up to 22 before. Okay, let's go back to some of the Q&A questions here. Let's see, a lot of questions in the Q&A, so that's great. Max is asking a question: did labor union movements lean towards the Marxist or liberal movements? It's again, for our purposes, that's not tremendously important. That's not particularly important. So I'm not going to. Yeah, you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry about that. So we're not going to address that. Don't worry about that. Okay, let's see. Let's take a question from Gregory Presser. Okay, liberalism with nationalism. How does the France example of the July Revolution express both liberalism and nationalism? So let's this is something which is specifically for the H question. Excuse me, for the H class. It's This is something specifically, again, not for the. This is not for the not for the A class. How is this liberalism and nationalism? I'm trying to think whether this is something that I should address now or wait specifically for the exam, just because it is a very good question, and I had this question down as a possibility or a possible question for the honors class. Let me put it this way: in terms of this is less of an issue of nationalism and more of an issue of liberalism. It's more of an issue of liberalism in that the issue is becoming the return of absolute monarchy in 1830, and the taking away of various rights that had been guaranteed to France after the Congress of Vienna. So I think I'm going to leave it at there, because I think this may be something which this actually deals with the reading that you have, but I also am contemplating adding this as a question on the exam. Let's see. Okay, let's go back to the Q&A. A lot of questions. Okay. So from Rachel, what was the last what from the last coalition will be on the test, the most important factor of it? Just there's a long history of last coalitions. There were 7 coalitions following or the last stages of Napoleon's life. The last coalition simply is the downfall of Napoleon, really the first downfall of Napoleon after his defeat in Russia, the final defeat of Napoleon, the conquest of Paris, and his ultimate defeats. That's the most important parts that we discussed in class. Okay, good. Let's take some more questions from the Q&A. A lot of questions in the Q&A, which is great to see. Let's take another question from Max. Can you please highlight important points in the relationship between imperialism and nationalism? Highlight the important points in the relationship between imperialism and nationalism. Well, this is something we discussed, I think, in some of the classes today. Part of what's driving imperialism is the notion of European superiority, is the idea that my country in Europe has far greater superiority than the Africans, of course, but also of other European countries. The drive to conquer Africa was part of, or was really part and parcel of the Industrial Revolution, as we mentioned, but also by the fact that countries wanted to conquer and show that they could create an empire in Africa. And so there's a sense that that imperialism, again, driven by nationalism, simply because nations are competing for overseas empires. The idea is that my nation is better than yours, that my nation can conquer more than yours, is certainly a nationalistic idea, not rooted not necessarily in the concept of nationalism that we discussed, but but the idea that my country has the capability, my country has the ability to conquer African nations is certainly grounded in the idea of nationalism. Okay, let's go to a question from the email from Ben. Do we need to know specific inventions in the Industrial Revolution, says Jenny and Steve Edgen, or just what they brought about? No, I mean, you have to know some of the more important inventions. You don't need to know, again, you don't need to know every specific detail, but know what these inventions, what they were, what they caused. I'm not going to ask you to tell me the years they were invented and the inventors, but know that they had an impact specifically when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to the increased process in the late 18th century of creating and crafting better models of transportation. So again, with the tests, and this is true for both the H and the A's, details are important, but I'm not going to expect or require you to be versed in every single one of the details. If you can, in this case, Ben, if you can tell me what the ultimate goals of these inventions were, what they brought about, their importance, as opposed to memorizing the details of when they were created and who created them, that's more important. Okay, let us delete that. Okay, let's go. Talia, can you lay out a timeline for the events that we learned about for the test? How about the 19th century? I mean, I can't. All of these events, all of the things that we discussed, all the things that you learned, everything, all the things that you read, and as I'm sure you can see, there's, for whatever the amounts we discussed in class, there was lots to read about also. That's simply a function of the fact that we just didn't have the time to finish and to talk about everything we wanted to or we needed to in the 19th century. But there's too much here of a in terms of laying out a timeline. It would be helpful, I think, for everyone to go through the textbook and then the way that that we discussed the various topics in class. The focus wasn't chronological, but they were thematic, largely because we needed to build on the particular topics in order to understand each and every one. So that was. Sorry, my wife is running around looking for something. So she can come in and say hi if she wants to. I don't know if she wants to. She's waving. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, guys. They can't hear me.
No, they can hear you.
Hi, guys.
There you go.
Study hard.
Jessica says to study hard. Okay, whatever that means. Jessica is promising cookies to the highest grades. So no, I'm joking. I'm kidding. We're not going to do that. That's terrible. We're not going to do that. Okay, but in terms of we covered this not chronologically but thematically because we were working on top of each other, and the last topic that we're talking about now is imperialism, and imperialism very much is tied into a lot of what we discussed, but all of these topics are tied into what we discussed with each other. I can't lay a chronology here because this is really jumping around from different parts of the 19th century, so I can't lay out that chronology. Okay. Let's go back to some of the Q&As here. Okay, another question from Talia. This is a good question. What are some of the consequences of the Congress of Vienna? Not that the other questions aren't good, but this is an important question for both the H and the A's. What are some of the consequences of the Congress of Vienna? So the Congress of Vienna, there are multiple consequences, and the consequences range from abolition, the getting rid of the slave trade after 1815, which impacts imperialism, the recreation or reconstitution of monarchies all throughout Europe. That is particularly important, particularly specifically for the context of nationalism. The desire to maintain peace in France, in Europe, and the desire to ensure peace, as you can see, and I'm sure as you can read, and this is something which I may want to ask on the test: was the Congress of Vienna successful in what they had prescribed? Were they successful in maintaining peace? Were they successful? Were their ideas successful of maintaining monarchies as the best way of maintaining government? So, as opposed to asking simply what are the consequences, you need to use the material that we discussed in class, the data that the materials that you read in the textbook to answer that question. So that's particularly important. As a way of thinking about sort of the consequences of what the Congress of Vienna brought, creating buffer zones between France and other nations. We talked about that in the context of Italy. We talked about that for the context of for the context of Italy. So all of those different elements are some of the consequences, and it would be useful for you to think about, for everyone to think about. Again, each according to both the A levels and the H level, each according to what we discussed in class, whether the consequences, or what specifically the consequences, whether they were on the whole positive. So, for instance, again, the decision for the Congress of Vienna or the desire for the Congress of Vienna to keep peace in Europe, was that achieved? So think about that in the context of everything we talked about in class. Good. Okay, let's go to one of the email questions. Okay, you know what? No, we're gonna go back to the Q&A. A lot of Q&A questions. Far too many than what we can say. I'm just going to highlight this from Yanni for a second. Thanks, Dr. Zadoff's wife. I will tell her you all say that. Thank you, Yanni. Okay, let me just, and this is just important. This is from Max again. Are the uprisings of the 1830s and 1848 applicable to the A-level classes? We did not discuss 1830 in class. I don't think you were assigned it as part of the reading. 1848 we did not discuss, so the A levels are not responsible for that. We did not discuss that in class. Coffee, gotta stay up tonight, guys, to finish grading papers. That's what I'm going to do tonight. Okay, I'm just looking for something here that can be applicable for both the H and the A's. A lot of questions here. Wow. I almost feel paralyzed by the number of questions here in the Q&A. A lot of good questions. Okay, so this is a question from Daniel Eady. For nationalism and liberalism in the reading, it discussed Greece, Poles, Ireland, Germany, and Belgians. Are those all examples of nationalism without liberalism? Also for France, why was there nationalism involved? So just to let me deal with the second question first. In France, why was there nationalism involved? Again, the goal of nationalists was to get rid of monarchy. Nationalists wanted to get rid of monarchy. They didn't want monarchy they didn't want a monarch. They didn't want a king to rule. And so in almost all instances in France goes through, and for the H class, you know this better than the A class, is a series of revolutions in the late 18th and 19th centuries, meaning the French Revolution that we discussed, beginning in 1789, is only the start of the revolutionary process in France and arguably continues into the 20th century. The goal in each of those revolutions arguably was to somehow get rid of the monarch. So that was one of the key elements of nationalism in France. For nationalism and liberalism in Greece, Poland, Ireland, Germany, Belgians. Again, this is something specific for the H level classes. I'm not going to mention France. I'm not going to mention Austria because that's part of your reading. But in the various instances, you can see in Greece there is a sense of liberal ideology. What I would say though is that in almost all of these cases, there's a liberal desire to push equality and to push equal opportunity. And in almost every case of a nationalistic uprising, you're going to see some sense of liberalism. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to see the full gamut of liberal ideas take hold, and I think that's the case. That's the case in the various cases that you discussed, Daniel. I would say though, for the H classes, and this is particularly true for the reading you have, you need to think long and hard as you're going through the reading whether and there, the H level reading focuses on France and Austria in 1848, middle of the 19th century, and it goes into a lot more detail than the textbook here does. You need to think long and hard whether there are liberal ideas manifest in those revolutions, in the Revolution of France in 1848, and in Austria and in Hungary in the middle of the 19th century. Also, that's something I'm going to save for the exam. Okay, let's see. Oh, let's go back to the Q&A questions. Guys, this is fun. Best way to spend a Monday night. So something here from Dana. I actually think we could spend from now until 9:30 just answering questions by Dana. So we'll see. Maybe we'll do that. Can imperialism just be the conquest of land, or must be economic influence or political? It can be any of those things. It doesn't have to be. It can be one. It can be all three. In truth, it wasn't. It almost was never simply just a conquest of land. There's always another element involved. It could be political. It could be economic. Economic in various contexts, whether it's the case of Egypt with protecting assets, whether it's the case of Belgium in the Congo trying to gain raw materials. It can be a series of different elements. It's not always just one or the other. It can be one. It can be all three. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be one or all three. Okay. Let's go. Okay, so this is something from Zachary Rosenblatt. The question concerns India. What is the importance of the British annexation of India? How can we compare it to other versions of imperialism? That's a fantastic question, Zachary, and that very well could appear on the exam for both the H classes and the A classes. British imperialism in Africa appears on both. Just because we may not get to discussing it in class specifically, in terms of India, India was a unique case. India is ruled by Britain sort of in two steps. First, it's the East India Company, and my hope is to get to this tomorrow in class. We'll just by the way, as a preview for tomorrow in class, we'll run through, finish up Egypt, finish the Congo, South Africa very quickly, and talk about India very quickly, and that will be the last thing on the exam. So we should be able to get that through in class tomorrow. But just to give you a heads up, the British annexation of India, the British involvement in India is sort of taking two steps. First, the East India Company. The East India Company was one of these exploration companies which were economically involved in different parts of the world. The East India Company dominated India during the first half of the 19th century. It had its own army. The army was led by British officers. It was staffed by Indian soldiers called sepoys. What eventually takes over is a rebellion, the Sepoy Mutiny, and we'll talk about the details of the Sepoy Mutiny tomorrow in class. After the Sepoy Mutiny was really a turning point because at that point the British government directly takes control of Britain in a period called the Raj, the British rule. The Queen of England is given the title of Empress of India. The British government takes direct control, and they maintain direct control through the middle of the 20th century. The impact in the textbook, as it goes into this, the impact is in trade goods. The impact is in the various elements of imperialization. The British in India, like they did in Egypt, restricted various industries in India, and in India specifically the cotton textiles. On the other hand, Britain did industrialize India like parts of Africa. But you can think of this because this very well may be a question on the exam. So it's a good question. Okay, this is fun. This is fun. Okay, let's go back to some of the Q&A questions. And these are building here. This question just came in from Ellie Seidman. Does the A class need to know about utilitarianism, utopian ideals, and socialism? Let me take a look quickly. I believe they do. Yeah. Yeah, it was part of the readings. So you had this as part of the readings, and so yes, you do need to know this. Some of this we talked about in class. We talked laissez-faire economics. We talked Marx. We mentioned socialism briefly in class. You also do need to know unions as from the textbook reading. So the answer to that question is yes. Was part of the readings. Okay, question from Talia. What are the major themes we should take out of the Age of Napoleon? It's a good question. Well, think about Napoleon in terms of nationalism. Think of Napoleon in terms of the consequences of his actions. Think about Napoleon in the Congress of Vienna. Those are important themes. Napoleon represents, I think, sort of the last point in time that in the 19th century that we see a single individual conquer the entirety of Europe. Obviously, in the 20th century, we're going to see that occur again, but as in the 19th century, we don't really see that the conquest of the entirety of Europe. So think about that, and think about what Napoleon attempted to do, his various actions, what Napoleon himself caused. You can think about it in this way, and I'll just suggest this: that Europe united as a result of Napoleon's actions. whether it's the various coalitions, whether it's the Congress of Vienna. Napoleon brought together elements and parts of Europe which had never been aligned with each other. That's an interesting theme to think about in the context of the consequences of Napoleon. So, good question. Oh, okay. Let's look at more. Let's see. Any questions coming in by the email? Okay, so I'll take some questions from the email now from Julia Cohn with a K. How is liberalism connected to nationalism, and how is it not? I discussed that already before. Liberalism, nationalism share some ideas, but there are instances when they are separate from each other. So I'm not going to go into detail that before because we discussed that before. Also, what is the agricultural revolution and the ancient regime, the old regime? That's something specific for the H and not for the A. That's really leading up to. Oh no, excuse me. Sorry, that's really both for. Well, let me put it this way: for the Industrial Revolution element of it, that's part of both the H and the A as a lead up to the French Revolution. That only is the H aspect of it. The Agricultural Revolution, if we're talking the Industrial Revolution, a complete change in the middle of the 18th century in the way that people grew crops, for instance. We can talk about in the Industrial Revolution, various ways in which crops were managed, whether it's crop rotation and closures. These are all part of the beginnings of industrialization. Agriculture paving the way for new technologies being created in agricultural technology, and impacting industrialization. Whether it's just the various creations, the various creative technological innovations in the later part of the 18th century. Okay, let's talk about. Come back to that in a second. Questions from Ali. How many French revolutions were there, and what were they? Okay, so there were a number of different French revolutions. The major first French Revolution, 1789, is one element, but really we see revolutions in 1823 and 1830. In 1848 is another revolution. So all of those different instances, we see a variety of, or those are instances of revolutions in France. Okay, that's one question. Where do we see liberalism or nationalism in Germany? Was there both? So this is directly related to actually the A level reading, because the A classes have reading on Germany and nationalism in Germany. That's a very good question, and that's something that's a question which will possibly show up on the exam itself. Specifically thinking about Germany and Italy and comparing Germany and Italy, and whether we see, as we discussed in Italy, that I think you can make a fairly clear argument that liberalism is really not part of the nationalistic enterprise. That nationalism and liberalism are separated from each other, and that's useful to think about whether Germany is the same way, whether liberalism and nationalism are separate, or whether they are combined together in Germany. I'm not going to answer that question directly, because I think that's something that the A's in particular should think about, because that's very possible. It's a very plausible and possible question for questions for a question that may appear on the first part of their exam. Okay. Plugging along again. Just to give a heads up for anybody, there are far too many questions here to answer all at once, or to answer tonight in the next 25 minutes. So we're not going to have time to answer all of these questions now. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Let's see what to choose here. So this is from Dana. Why was Victor Emmanuel chosen to be king? I assume you're meaning king over Italy in 1861 after unification. Largely was a function of the fact that he was the one who really started the unification process, more so than any other figure. He was the one who was most involved and most engaged in unifying Italy, and so he was the natural choice to be the leader and to be the king of Italy after unification. Okay. I'm just going to choose this just to point out. This is from Yanni. Does the Great Reform Bill represent liberalism? We discussed this already. I think Max asked that question, or someone asked that question before. So we discussed that already previously in the Hangout. So I'm not going to answer that again right now. Okay, something from Gabriella Wolf. Were Jacobin supporters of Napoleon? Did he base any of his ideas off of him, or was he not supported by them? In terms of the Jacobins were largely gone by the time Napoleon comes to power. So there really isn't an involvement between the Jacobins and Napoleon. What was different? And again, this comes from Gabriella. This is something specifically for the H. What was the difference between how Jacques Necker and de Cologne dealt with government's money? Simply, this is a matter of it's not a matter of dealing with the money. It's a matter of these were the appointees of Louis XVI in trying to deal with the economic situation. There's the process in terms of how this was dealt with, whether it was dealt with, whether higher taxes were, or whether the National Assembly, the States General, excuse me, were called. It was simply a matter of the process. So that specifically is for the H level classes. Okay, so going back to some of the Q&A. Okay, so a question from Yanni. Did people like the National Assembly or not really? Well, the goals of the National Assembly, again, this is for the French Revolution, so this is specifically for the H classes. It's not a matter of liking it or not, but they were forced out. Given that the radicals, specifically Jacobins, and those who were radical, the more radical elements in France wanted to get rid of the monarchy in the first place. So the National Assembly, at least initially, the goal was to ensure equality. Now, arguably between 1789 and 1791, it didn't. Sorry, between 1789 and 1792, and arguably didn't get to those. It didn't fulfill those actions, but at least the original intent of it was to ensure equality. I mean, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the goal of it was to ensure equality, to ensure rights. But it didn't satisfy the need, particularly of the radicals, to get rid of monarchy and to create a republican form of government, which which is what the radicals wanted to accomplish. And so the National Assembly ultimately did not live up to its need or to the desires of those who wanted to form a republican form of government in France as opposed to a monarchy. Okay. Let's keep going with the Q&A questions. These are pouring in from people all over the world, from New Jersey, from Hawaii, from Guatemala, all different questions of people looking and asking questions on the 19th century. It's incredible. Okay, I'm just looking for questions here which can be used specifically for both classes. So this is another question by Dana. And like I said, we can probably just answer the questions by Dana from now until the end of the night. Conservatism. This is something mentioned by the textbook. Conservatism is basically keeping status quo. Conservatism is the opposite of liberalism. If liberalism wants to give greater equality, conservatism very much wants to keep the status quo in maintaining monarchy, and maintaining aristocracy, and maintaining the old system, the old structure, the old society. So conservatism usually thought of as something that wealthy landowners wanted to perpetuate and wanted to continue, but conservatism is often seen as the opposite as liberalism. Fantastic. Sorry again. Let's see. Next time I should really just bring in some music also. We can do a musical interlude. Oh, actually, no. I have my phone right here. I can put on hold music, and we can do a whole thing as I'm looking through the questions here. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to play a song. If you guys can hear it, let me know. If anyone can identify this song, you get big props. So let's see. I'm just going to keep this on until I find a good question to get. My country, all earthly things above and time, and the whole imperfect, the service of my love. Okay. That asks no question, the love that's done. All right, let's just take this in order. Can anyone identify this song? No. Let's see. Let's try it this way. Can anyone identify this song? That never falters, the love that pays the price. Let's see. Wow. We have a winner. Can someone... Okay, besides just identifying the song, can someone tell me what the meaning of the song? Because so far we do have a winner in terms of identifying the song. This is fun. We should do this more often, guys. Just play songs here. Okay. Let's see. So we do have winners here in terms of identifying the song, but I'd like to hear what the significance of the song is. Okay, let's go back to these questions. Question here from Max. Can you please highlight important points in the relationship between imperialism and nationalism? We talked about this before, in terms of European superiority as the key factor as one of the key factors in imperialism. So we discussed that before. We're going to go back to it now. Let's see. So yes, the answer for Talia and for Rachel, I vow to thee my country. That is the correct song. But can you tell me what the significance of that song, of the song is? I vow to thee my country. Very good job identifying. I assume if you didn't know the song, it's a pretty out there. Too old of a song from Yanni. Never heard this song. Yeah, it's a pretty significant song. Let's see. Let's take this question here from Talia. What is the difference between imperialism and industrialism? I mean, they're different in terms of their focuses. Industrialism is specific in regards to economic developments. Imperialism is the conquest. They are tied to each other, and we mentioned this in what we discussed this in class, that industrialism, the desire to create new markets, the desire to create to find new goods, to find raw material, that certainly drives imperialism. That certainly drives the imperialistic need and desire, and so we mentioned that in class today. But I mean, they're separate in terms of their originality and their creation, but they are tied together. So okay, we are. Let's see. Talia gets the answer right as to "I vow to thee my country," and let's see. Greg also. The song is nationalistic. It's about what we are learning. Yes, correct. It is a patriotic song from England. It was Princess Diana's one of her favorite songs. Very good guys in identifying the song. Okay, a couple of more questions. Okay. Highlight. So this is highlight important. This is from Max. Can you please highlight important points in the relationship between industrialization and nationalism? We're not going to get into that. There are important points, but that's not something we're going to get into right now. So I'm not going to point those questions. Okay. So this is question from Dana. Where'd the question go? Let's see. There we go. Okay. Why did Charles X make the 4 ordinances, and what did they do? So this is discussing, this is something specific to the H classes, discussing sort of what leads up to 1830, and leading up to the revolutions, leading up to 1830 and the July revolutions. This is something. The 4 ordinances severely limited the rights of individuals in France, and that's part of the reaction, part of what the July Revolution is all about. That Charles X limited the various rights of people in France, the right of free speech, the right of the press, among others, and this leads to a desire really to push the monarchy out for good, and so he does this. He did this largely in response to the gains by liberals who during elections had been voted into the various to the two houses of to the lower house of legislature in France, and he does this. Charles X takes this opportunity to pass these ordinances, to pass these laws as a response to the liberal gains. It's a reaction to the desire of the liberal, or a reaction to really the popularity of the liberals leading up to the July Revolution. Okay, excellent. Let's take a couple more questions from the Q&A. Let's see what else is here. So here, so just another question from Dana. Did we discuss nationalism in Ireland and Germany? If so, what was it? We mentioned it very, very briefly. In Ireland, the desire was for home rule. Ireland had been conquered, had been taken over by England in 1800. The desire was for Ireland to regain its freedom back from England, and so this was done. This was a question debated throughout the 19th century in England, whether Ireland should be granted home rule, whether they should be given the freedom to rule by themselves. Irish nationalists obviously wanted this. It was only granted to them. It was debated throughout the 19th century. It was only granted into the early 20th century. Nationalism in Germany, you read about in the textbook, and I'm not going to comment on that specifically now because that's partially what the 10A classes is going to be focusing on. So I'm not going to be answering that right now. Okay. The July Revolution. So this is an email question from Ali. The July Revolution, we discussed this in class. This is the overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy, the ascent of Louis Philippe, the Duke of who becomes king. It marks the shift from the Bourbon monarchy. It creates it's really as a result of Charles X's desire to limit the power of the liberals, to limit the power or limit the freedoms of the liberals, or excuse me, limit the freedom of the peoples of France through the four ordinances. The July Revolution, commonly referred to as the Second Revolution, because it pushes out the Bourbon monarchy. It doesn't push out monarchy in general, because Louis Philippe becomes king, but Louis Philippe, in becoming king, was forced to allow different or to continue on liberal ideas, specifically various freedoms and giving equality to all Frenchmen. So that's basically, in essence, what the July Revolution. That's something specific that we discussed for the H classes. Good. Okay. Let's take on a couple of more questions from the Q&A. Oof. Getting tired here. Okay, a couple more questions from the Q&A, and then we'll call it a night fairly soon. Let's see. Let's see if there's anything that we can talk specifically for the H and the A's. Let's see. Highlight the important points in the relationship between industrialization and imperialism. I think we talked about this twice already, so we're not going to talk about it again. From Dana, Charles Grey was prime minister, but William IV was king. This was during the Great Reform Bill of 1832. That's what you're referring to specifically. Okay, good. Um, There's another question from Dana. Did Napoleon ever let the Jews in? I know we said they thought they should. Okay, so we're going to come to this question starting on Friday. We're going to begin to talk about Jewish history, and that's what we're going to be doing all of next week. So that's not on the test. So you don't need to. That's not. You're not going to be. That's not going to be tests. That's not going to be on the test. Yanni, the July Revolution. I mentioned that before. The July Revolution, the Revolution of 1830. The same thing. We discussed it in class again. That's specific to the H class. Okay. Let's see. Okay, sorry, just to bring this up again, this is from Rachel. What were the 3 laws from laissez-faire economics? This is in the textbook. So people working for their own good is the first. Competition forces to make better products is the second, and supply and demand. That's the third. That's the third rule. So those are the 3 rules of laissez-faire economics. Okay, good. Okay, let's see what else is here. Let's see, any more questions? Just going back to the email from Leah, what specific names from this test do we need to know? Do we need to know every single person that did something, or just certain ones? I don't have a way of answering that question. I guess the answer to that question is yes. You need to know people that we discussed in class. You need to know from the textbook. I mean, that's if we discussed it, then the possibility is certainly a possibility that it's on it. By the way, this is sponsored by Starbucks. This entire night is sponsored by Starbucks. Even though this coffee is not Starbucks, the cup is Starbucks. Okay. Should we do another song to close us out? Just to put up another song here. Let's see if you guys can get this song. I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can find it very quickly. This is a good one. I don't think you'll get this one, but we can go out listening to. We can go out to listening to this song here. Okay, let's see if someone can get this for us to identify it. It's a good song. Let's see. Okay, let's see if there are any more questions in the meantime. In the meanwhile, let's see. I want Starbucks. Okay. From Dana, who's Hegel? So confused by him. I think I mentioned this in class when we were talking about Marx, but don't. This is for the H class specifically. Don't worry about it. So, okay. Okay. Anyone identify this song? This is not easy. Okay. Just one other question. This is from Julia Cohn to see what should we know for the Italian unification. That's a good question. We should again just go through the key elements of Italian unification, the process, the key players, the key characters in this process. Think about specifically what the relationship between nationalism and liberalism, I think, is something to think about, particularly in Italian unification. Okay, let's see. Anyone get this? Wow, you guys are quick with getting these songs. Let's see. The Girl by City and Color, Talia, and Rachel. Good, you guys are right. You guys tell me what you're using to get these songs. You guys are now listening to the playlist that I have on my phone. Okay. With that, there's still questions to answer. We can talk about it over the next couple of days in class. We'll end just listening to City in Color, and listening to the song. And if you have other questions, we can talk about it in meetings. We can arrange meetings, and we'll spend part of the day on Wednesday talking about some of these issues in a short interview session on Wednesday. But I just want to reiterate, guys, that the test is going to be shorter. It's not going to include. It's not going to be a long test. The goal is not to test you on whether you can memorize all of this information. That's not really what I'm looking for. Not what I really care about that much. But I just want to see how you guys synthesize the information. So I want to see how you guys take all of the different isms and see what you can do with it. And that's part of what we're going to be doing. That's part of what you're doing with the readings, and part of what you're doing with the readings, and part of what you're doing with the information. Let's see how you synthesize all of this. All right. Thanks for all the questions. I had a good time, and I will see all of you guys tomorrow. Have a good night, everyone.